Okay, so yeah, he was a media pundit. He sort of rose through independent media, had his own podcast and everything else. And what he would used to do was, and I'm sure people have seen the online memes of a guy sitting behind a desk with a microphone and a sign taped to the front saying "Change my opinion." That was what Charlie Kirk did. He went out to universities, colleges. He went out in the public and basically asked people to come and talk to him and to change his opinion on things. So he was obviously presenting a right-leaning conservative opinion on issues, social issues, economy, military, the whole gamut. But he wanted to have people come and talk to him because, well, challenge his opinion, challenge his point of view. Is it possible that what he was believing and spouting was wrong? Give him a better argument and he'll follow it. And so it was also done to try and, well, share his point of view with the person he was debating with to try and find out, well, are you arguing from a point of accuracy? Are you just relying on hearsay, or are there facts that I can use to improve or change my position? And so it'd be like change my mind. And so over time, he got more and more attention, and would it became a bit more of a an organised thing. Like he'd have his little tent set up, and he'd sit there, and he'd have a mic set up, and people would line up and challenge him on various issues, and they'd have a debate. And in general, there was no violent rhetoric. He only chose to engage through debate, and only with people who were willing to talk to him. He gave people the floor to explain their position and to try and change his mind, um, which is the sort of interaction you want to have when you're talking about politics or those sort of things, because it it's a sign of an open mind that, well, maybe the position I believe in isn't the best one. Maybe there's better positions. Maybe both sides are wrong, and we can improve what we believe and why we believe it. And I don't recall seeing or hearing him shout down the opposition or protesters and things like that. And because he rose out of the social media space, he certainly took a more prominent role in Donald Trump's second election to the presidency. And yep, I mean, there'd been threats made against him previously, like there were campuses, college campuses, where they were not able to set up after previously having had permission to do so. And wasn't the case they just arbitrarily went onto campuses and set up. They apparently sought the appropriate permissions and everything else, and especially later on as it attracted mass audiences. I mean, you see the footage surrounding the shooting today of how many people were attracted to hear him talk, and not necessarily hear him talk, but hear him debate, and to listen to what other students and other people who weren't him had to say, and to hear this exchange of ideas that had been brought to them. And so, yeah, he was obviously heavily involved. I mean, he was only fairly young, 31, and sadly he was shot in the neck by a fairly long range. Well, it wasn't someone standing next to him with a handgun. He was shot from a distance, shot through the neck, and initially was believed to have survived the shooting, but subsequently the news was updated to say that he'd passed away. And quite reasonably, it has drawn outrage from those on the conservative side, plus some on the left. There'd been a lot of rhetoric, and usually from the left, that the election of Trump was going to lead to right-wing death squads, that there's going to be a dictator locking up and executing the gays, or all sorts of insane statements like that that had no bearing in reality. Um, well, we're quite delusional, to be quite honest. And the the evidence, I mean, people have said, look, if there are right-wing death squads roaming the streets, people would know about it. It would be impossible to keep that sort of thing under wraps in the US. I mean, if that was the case and the right wing controlled thought and stuff like that, we'd see a very different social media. We'd see a very different online presence for a lot of people, and they're like, "Oh no, we're fighting the right, fighting for the good fight." But most of the mass media leans left. Most of the major newspapers lean left. Most of the online social media sites lean left. Up until Elon Musk bought Twitter, it was, well, it was suspected, but proven after he bought it, that conservative voices were being suppressed. And not just being suppressed, but often suppressed in coordination with other social media sites, or sometimes even in coordination with the government. And those with leftist voices largely ignored the authoritarian nature of that, and well, often celebrated it, pretending that because there were no conservative voices, or very few conservative voices, it meant that their ideology was the correct one, that it was winning the day, that they had this progressive wonderland. But the reality being that the government wasn't producing it, wasn't providing it. If anything, um, there was a very ineffectual delivery of things, and that there are many, many opportunities where Trump could have gone gloves off and brought the hurt down. And people said that was the case when he activated the National Guard to protect federal agents in Los Angeles and things like that. Yet the court system has kind of backed his approach on it. And as we had a look at the article the other day, despite everyone saying he's authoritarian, they have to accept and admit that he is only exercising the powers that have already been granted to the president. He is not overstepping his bounds. He just may be using them in a way that voices on the left don't agree with. And it's like people who are like, "I know right-wing death squads, this and that." They almost forget the history of what left-wing death squads have done, of what socialist uh, militantism and militancy has achieved, and that you can stir hatred through speech just as much as you can by giving someone a gun and pointing them in a direction. But whenever it happens, they wash their hands and look in the other direction. That uh, things that they latch onto, which seem to fall through because they're ideologically driven, or they push an outcome. It's like saying that the thing that killed BLM more than anything else was the introduction of body cams, because, well, the left argued for it because I know it's going to prove that the cops are racist and all cops are bastards, etc. But what it showed was that by and large, the police interaction with the black community and with minority communities was appropriate, or if anything, it was very soft-handed. It was just that these instances of violent outcomes were few and far between, and that the narrative beforehand had glossed over key elements of the incident, of key facts, and left and left things to be. And you look at where political violence actually has come from, where who'd led riots. Now, you look at, say, Kyle Rittenhouse. Okay, he was a conservative individual who shot 3 people at a series of riots in Kenosha. The Kenosha Kid, as people might say. Now, there are still people out there today who believe that he shot 3 black men, when the truth, as captured on from various video sources and as found through the subsequent court case, was that he fired in self-defense, and that the people who he ended up killing and shooting were not the sort of people that you wanted to put at the forefront of an organization or of an ideology as to hold up as good character examples. But that was allowed to be hidden and suppressed from the narrative. And that the violence in the streets of Seattle and Portland and places like that, where not so much Proud Boys, I mean, they were a weird organisation as they were, where they came under attack through street violence, and you had the running battles on the streets, unarmed battles, and people hitting each other with skateboards and bike locks and things like this, where people were emboldened to violence because they believed the rhetoric that they were morally right. They weren't necessarily right, but they believed in that they were going to be held up as some sort of moral victor, and that their commitment to violent action was justified. And the fact that the opposing viewpoint was being suppressed in the media and on social media and things like that only further encouraged it. If we're to be brutally honest, what we've seen in the last probably decade plus or so is that political violence is driven from the left. There are, to be honest, examples of political violence coming from the right. No one should deny that. But the predominant street level violence that's coming out and is from the left. There were at least 2 assassination attempts against Trump during the election. One of whom, that, but for Trump turning his head, would have killed him. The second one is currently going through court at the moment and is elected to represent himself. But you had these individuals who believed the rhetoric given to them from the left. I mean, even the one that winged Trump, there's still debate as to who that individual was, because there was identification of a person who'd gone to fight in Ukraine because they'd followed this leftist thing. But the weird thing is, like everyone's saying Nazi and fascist as some means to decry anyone slightly to the right of Mao, falls flat. It's a means to discredit. Yet you ask them to define what it means to be fascist, what exactly that person is doing that is fascist in action or belief or thought. They can't do it. Or that represents National Socialism in action. They can't do it. Now, is there an authoritarian presence to right-wing extremism? Yes. Again, no one's denying that, but it's the blanket painting of any conservative position as extreme that is, I think, finally making people lose their temper and lose their willingness to accept action without consequences. As we saw when that politician got shot in the west of Ukraine, his party that he founded were Nazis. Well, social nationalist, NatSoc, and they had very clear Nazi symbology. That particular article and bits of news disappeared very quickly from the news cycle. because it didn't fit the narrative of, oh no, 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 there's no Nazis there. It's the other side that are the Nazis and the fascists and everything else. It's the sort of thing that when you look at actual fascists in action, you go back and look at, say, the Spanish Civil War, where you did have um, communists on one side, well, and very much socialists on one side, the international brigades and whatnot, and the fascists on the other. And you look at uh, the abhorrent extremes that both sides engaged in under the banner of their ideology. I'm sure the Catholic Church still hasn't forgiven them for what they did. And depending on how you read into George Orwell's life, his experience there fighting for the international brigades led to him taking the position that led to books like Animal Farm in 1984. And that, as we look at it, post World War II, have a look at the violent groups that emerged in Germany and Italy and places like that, Red Hand and groups like that. They were by and large socialist. Now, it could be argued that they'd been receiving funding under the table from the other side of the Iron Curtain as an attempt to destabilise a capitalist economy, governments, etc., and as a result, it met the soft objectives of the Soviet Union. Yep, you could argue that, I guess, maybe. I'm sure someone probably got a PhD out of that. But you look then into, say, the end of the decolonisation of Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but Rhodesia, as Mozambique, Angola, and you look at who was funding and supporting the rebels at the time. So in Angola, it was the Cubans and Russians and East Germans and people like that. And there's books written by, I think the one that I can think of right now is Agent 47, which was written by a South African woman who all along had been probably ideologically aligned with the ANC, but she initially joined the South African police and had begun, because of her ideological leanings, had sort of led to undercover work. But when the ANC found out what she was doing, it almost led to a very bloody end for her. But that prompted me then to go and have a read up about these prison camps that the ANC and other groups ran over the border in Angola and other places, which then led me to um, uh, Marx International, or the internationalist Marxist groups, that had a, quite a detailed critique, a negative critique of the actions of the ANC and ZANU and various other Marxist and communist rebel groups in southern Africa at the time, about how a lot of the violence they carried out was targeted at fundamentally their own supporters. And that, if anything, they wanted to distance themselves from those actions. But to listen to the rhetoric that flies around the net, it's like, well, no, that sort of stuff's there. It's like when Antifa or anti-fascist action sort of was recreated or came back into the fore. It wasn't black bloc, but they're probably not far from black bloc anarchism. But it's like people went, oh, well, they fought the Nazis. They must be good, without stopping to consider what Antifa were when they were created, who created them, why they were created, and what they did. If anything, the Nazi attempts to fight them and suppress them before they really took power was quite possibly a good thing. Yet it goes without, like they're going without question, and it's the the idea that uh, not so much there's a creeping socialism, um, but it hides behind a banner of progressivism, and people have managed to identify the term progressive as a positive thing, as meaning a an improvement in condition over time. That's not necessarily the case. It's a bit like environmentalism. Um, Back when I was a kid, was when they introduced the idea of land care into Australia, which was kind of a recognition that a lot of farming practices on marginal farmland were destructive to the environment and leading to the loss of topsoil through water erosion, the formation of gullies where um, creeks and stuff should have been. It led to greater turbidity and issues in the water supply, which meant native um, fish stocks were affected because they couldn't deal with the change of things. It affected waterways, it affected the health of watersheds and water systems, all sorts of bits and pieces. Now, the idea of land care was about responsible stewardship of the land, or the idea that you wanted to preserve the viability of the soil and the terrain for future generations and basically for yourself as you continue to farm it, to remediate the damage that the past had caused, be it salinity or other things, protect waterways. It's like a it's like the balance between environmentalism, conservation to sustainability and exploitation. That was the sort of the spectrum we were taught in geography was environmentalism and conservation. Well, environmentalism was basically remove the humans from the environment and leave it alone as much as possible. Conservation was about responsible protection of the environment and ensuring that the native species and everything else were continue to live in a healthy manner. Sustainability was about working with the environment to provide agriculture and products that sustained human activity and human life, but did not come at a cost to the environment. That could be carried on indefinitely, basically, and that was what we should be targeting. And then there was just blatant exploitation. But even then, you had people who were hardcore environmentalists. Conservation was, yeah, I mean, seen almost as a step down by them, and they're like, no, 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 it's got to be this. No, 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 it's about responsible stewardship, sustainability, and you carry that across to political speech and things like that. And you go and look again at the rhetoric, even here in Australia, about what happened during COVID and how anybody who was not in lockstep, I've made the statement plenty of times, that people wondered how Nazism was allowed to emerge in Germany when it did. Like people were like, oh no, I would have stopped that. I would have said no to it. A lot of these people were so quick to John the jackboot when COVID struck that there are a lot of people who were, I mean, who followed what they were told and didn't stop to think about the consequences or why they were doing what they were told. And that when the opportunity arose for them to suppress others in a politically acceptable manner, that any idea of right or wrong went out the window. And those jackboots got donned so quickly. And then afterwards, as the nuances in the situation became better understood, they pretended that it never happened. Or they pretended that their involvement or the angry rhetoric they shouted online never took place. They absolved themselves of responsibility, which fundamentally doesn't happen. But even then, I mean, Victoria is the classic example. They had a very progressive government that fought its own supporters at one point and basically said, "Look, you're not going to the population. You're not going to do anything about it." In slightly different terminology, and but subsequently, the former premier's close alignment with China has now been targeted his own ideological purity. I mean, at some point, people are hoist on their own petards, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. But sadly, it is this idea of hateful rhetoric under the banner of hidden under the banner of progressivism, which I think has caused the most damage and is causing the most political damage and violence, political violence. And I think there's a lot of reasonable people are going to suddenly wake up one day and realize that they've been following a rhetoric that has led to things that they never wanted to happen. I think there's a lot of very reasonable people out there who follow along quite happily because that's what they've been told is the way it is, because all other voices were suppressed. And so when you have people like Charlie Kirk come along and openly and fairly discuss different ideology and allow people of all parts of the ideology spectrum or banner to voice what they believe in, to have him targeted and shot for attempting to find a middle ground is, well, very, very sad to begin with. But to many, it's indicative of the violence of the left. And at the moment, there is very little that is being done to counter that narrative or to counter that opinion. And people have been building it for a while and they believed it was coming and they can see it. And they're like, well, nope, you guys have done it. It's on your heads now. So, yes, it's sad for his family, young kids. And yeah, like it says, he's debated with students about issues like transgender identity, climate change, faith, family values, and obviously Trump saw him as a voice for the sort of conservative issues that Trump believed in. And so, yeah, it's to promote, well, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. Okay, traditionally Republican values, I guess. Um, it, it, he was probably one of the least divisive people out there and was willing to go and talk and listen. So, okay, people might have felt aggrieved at the fact he didn't espouse transgenderism and had a counter skepticism or had skepticism over COVID-19, which is fine. Okay, false claim. Okay, again, that's a rhetoric being pushed. You get it. If you're unwilling to look at the evidence that has been brought forward and I guess even look at the voting patterns between 2020 and 2024, you're not going to be convinced otherwise, and that's fine. You can continue to believe that, but understand that it is a belief. At the end of the day, Biden was appointed as the president by the electors, by the panel of electors. So according to the political system in the US, Biden was the 46th president. And that was he. At that point, you can't say he was illegitimate. Now, how the electors got to be there, that's where everybody's having where the issues arise. But it'd be wrong to say Biden was illegitimate. He was appointed by the processes that existed, and he was the 46th president. But the precursor to that, yeah, yeah, it's like people saying the evidence that you see, no, 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 that didn't happen, but it's right there. Nah, that's not what happened. That never happens. Yeah, it's yeah. So sadly, yes, he passed away. Um, and there is all sorts of media covering it because, yeah, I mean, I don't want to show the footage of the actual, um, yeah, this is just before he was shot, but the entire space he was in was packed with people. People wanted to hear him. People wanted to be there to debate. And yeah, uh, good job, SBS. It's even the actual events around that. I mean, who died on January the 6th? They were Trump supporters. The the Capitol Police that were alleged to have died on January 6th died later, um, mostly by suicide. And yeah, I mean, there were also people shooting state level politicians, even judges. There was also the hammer attack against Nancy Pelosi's husband, although I really don't know what the motivation behind that was. That one was weird. Um, this Gretchen Whitmer thing, um, I'm fairly certain that that's been shown to have been an FBI plot, and that, or that it was actually, there was a degree of association with that, and it's like um, Kamala Harris's push for outlawing lynching and stuff. Well, lynching was always outlawed; it's murder. But the Juicy Smollett falsification, he's claiming a hate crime that never existed. Yet the leftist rhetoric that supported it and slandered anybody who said, "Wait a second, there's big holes in the argument here." Um, that eventually it was shown he was lying. Ha! No, everyone's just moved on. The rhetoric moved on. It's like, oh, no, that's fine. It's like, well, hang on. There was there was an alleged attempt to carry out a hate crime that was also driven down political lines. Yet this political violence was falsified. Oh no, it was the what? It's the right that did it. Well, no. But does that stop people still claiming that it took place? And so not only was it falsified by the left, it was there are allegations that Kamala Harris might have had more of a hand in it than appears because she was pushing the anti-lynching bill at the time, and there is imagery of her with Jussie Smollett together in that rough time frame, and so yeah, U.S. politics is a mess. It's a mess. Um, I and you get now people trying to climb down from their positions. It's like no, you've done it. You've said it, and you can't back down from your statement like that. So the sad part of it too is almost immediately there were statements from on MSNBC that there was as to what took place, and it's like uh, it well, it beggars belief as to how it could have been done. Just trying to find. I mean, I did see it. I can't recall the article on which it is, and now people are like, oh no, it's a bad thing. Own your rhetoric. Accept your responsibility for driving the sort of hatred through speech that has led to it. That, uh, yeah, the rhetoric for the last decade was it's the right's fault that things were going to happen. But as it points out, the big history has shown that it's the left that undertook it. And yeah, people are now, oh no, we're pretending that it didn't happen. I I think there's going to be a lot of people who aren't going to back down on this. And yeah, it's, I mean, I don't know if it's going to have, no, not in that article. Yeah, and it's also, I guess, put fear into other conservative commentators that, well, they can be targeted just as much. And it's telling us, well, I mean, who comes out and says things, and it's like, no, if it wasn't for the death, you continue the hateful rhetoric against them. You don't get to suddenly jump on the moral high horse and pretend that you've always supported his ideas. No, 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 no. Does not work like that. And in fact, I did see on Twitter someone had put this up, which upset some leftists no end. But take a step back. Why did this phrase get created in the first place? Well, because of Islamic attacks against the Charlie Hebdo officers in France, because they'd published cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, the Islamic Prophet Muhammad. And people felt that those bloody attacks were too far when speech should be protected to a degree. And so, je suis Charlie. And I don't feel that this is necessarily out of place with what's happened. But it seems funny that they were not funny. It's sad that there are people on the left who can't understand that, in essence, it's almost the same thing. A person was killed because of his speech, and it was not violent, and it was speech that a lot of people didn't necessarily find completely abhorrent. There might have been things in it they were slightly offended by, but by and large, he wasn't advocating eradication of people or anything. And and so the phrase applies almost exactly the same. It's almost poetic how neatly it fits. And it's telling how much it has upset some. And not upset them in terms of making them sad, upset them in terms of making them angry. Because they were like, oh, this is our banner. Well, no, it never was. It was the case of everybody who came together to protest the Charlie Hebdo things wasn't left versus right. It was basically in response to militant Islamism. But no, people can't see beyond their own ideology, that anybody who isn't them is against them and must be the other side. Well, he's he's hoping his family at least can find some peace. But I think we're a long way from hearing the end of it. We're a long way from hearing the end of it. Well,